Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe this is a really important conversation, and I'm glad it's one I get to support, to propose, right? We think given that, if you look at how the media is today, we think they've gone too far. We think the reporting is incredibly invasive, that the majority of news is about what people wore, what they ate, what their children did, what they're doing at home. And we think the question is, where do we draw the line? So this is primarily a debate about politicians and whether or not it's important for us to know what happens in a politician's private life, but we think we should also consider broadly the role of the media and whether or not privacy is a fundamental right that belongs to human beings, and whether or not what the position the media is taking around privacy is a positive one or a negative one. So on the affirmative team today, our stance is that the privacy is a fundamental right that should be negated only when there is a clear need to negate that right. As first speaker, I will be talking about why it's a fundamental right, and then I will show you how there is no need for this primarily when in terms of determining the best candidate, and further what harms that this would possibly cause. My second speaker will further go into the harms and talk about the greater harms to politics and the harms to the media as a whole, right? So let's get right into this debate and discussing firstly then the notion of fundamental rights. We believe quite strongly on this side of the house that privacy is a fundamental right. It is a right. What privacy allows is for an individual to self-actualize, to be that individual's own private space, right? Because most of the time you're walking around and people are observing you. When you're walking the streets, when you're working, you have to dress so that someone else can observe and evaluate you based on how someone else sees you. What the only things that are private are in your thoughts, and what are the things that you do at home with yourself and with your family, and maybe your past. We think these are things that allow you to be free, to be as you want to be yourself. And we think that's important because it makes you feel comfortable and it helps you to develop a sense of self-esteem and to self-actualize. We think this is not a right we take away from all levels of society. We don't remove it from prisoners, right? We give even them some sense of privacy. We only check their cells on certain times. They still are allowed some personal space and personal products. We even give soldiers a right to privacy. And these are people you trust your lives with. So we think that it is something that we don't remove, but even if we do, it has to be in a very specific situation for a specific cause. Like I need to get a specific warrant to check your phone, right? To make sure that in case I'm worrying whether or not you're going to attack someone. Okay, so that's a fundamental right, and we think the onus is to show that need before that right is negated. Right? Now, so secondly then, how can we still determine who the best candidate is? Because I think that's how the media justifies this invasion of privacy. People need to know about the politicians, and the more they need to know is better, right? So we think the two things that the media is trying to show through this, or people try to determine about a politician, right? Firstly, the person's performance. Will the person function as the best politician that they could? So is he or she corrupt, or how they work at home, blah, 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 right? But secondly, also that person's character. How is their attitude? Are they someone honest? What is their sense and level of morality? And this is the justification around giving as much information around that politician as possible. I'm going to let a future politician give this point of information.
If I have different characters within my private life and then my public life, does it influence the ability of the politicians?
We don't think so. We think that what is important is how you function as a politician and what you do on the job. We don't think that if in your private life at home I wear a dress, if in my private life at home I'm doing things which I don't necessarily agree in, we think that is absolutely fine. We think individuals can be able to separate these two things, and they should be able to, right? You see an example, like the position of the Republican Party at a federal level is to be against policies of gay marriage or gay empowerment, but they are homosexual members of the Republican Party, and they are able to separate how their individual beliefs in homosexuality or their identity versus what they believe to be a positive policy for the nation. And we think this exists broadly around everything else, right? So we don't think that matters, okay? So, but more specifically, how does it matter to those two criteria that I set out? does it affect your job? We think it doesn't. There's enough official documentation, the targets and KPIs that people can meet. If that person is doing their job as a bureaucrat, if they're doing their job publicly good and well enough, then we think that's fine. And we think the media can and should report on how that person does his job, right? Secondly, what about that person's character, right? We think, again, there's still enough publicly available information because you guess that person's character by how they deal with crisis, how they come up to everybody and speak and they solve these problems. And we think it's okay for those individuals to personally give information about their character if they want to. But we don't think it's fine for the media to view people at home, to see how they treat their families, to go into their private life to check whether they are gay or not gay, whether they drink, whether they don't drink, whether they do all these other different things, which is what the media likes to report on and likes to go into, right? So we think that the line has to be drawn on what happens with that person at home and what happens to that person within their personal life, right? So what the harms finally that we think this will lead to is that we think this empowers tabloid journalism. We think this leads to a situation where journalists are interested more in what these politicians ate for breakfast rather than not that what the policies that they're presenting. We think that what they present to people are these characters of these politicians as celebrities rather than their work. And we think that's something that's very, very dangerous. Okay? So at the end of today's debate, we've showed you why privacy is a fundamental right. We've shown you why it's not necessary to determine who the best candidate is. And thirdly, we've said that it leads to even more harms if you continue with the trend. We're very happy to defend privacy.
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to politicians, we have to let them decide the future of the society. We have to let them set the laws or rules that can define my life, what I can do and what I cannot do. Because of this unique characteristic, we think it's very important for us to know who politicians really are, what kind of moralities they have, and what kind of private lives they enjoy. So we think that this motion should not pass, and we think that the media's current efforts to guide the citizens' vote and guide them to know who are the most capable candidates is doing a very good job, and we think private lives is an essential part of those informations. So I'm going to analyze this debate into two major areas. Firstly, when we can deprive the rights, fundamental rights, specifically privacy, and secondly, does media's effort is in vain or is it actually a necessary process? And my rebuttals will be integrated into my arguments. So on the first issue, when can we deprive privacy and when can we demand people to disclose their private rights? We think that the society has already been depriving privacy and other fundamental rights to all people, regardless of their occupation, regardless of their position, if it influences the ability of their jobs. For example, we demand them to disclose criminal records. We demand them to disclose their medical records, also in tax-related issues too. We do that because we need to find if that person is actually capable for the jobs that they're actually being upholding. So although the opposition or government team argue that privacy is a fundamental right to self-actualize, we agree to a certain extent, but if that self-actualization is directly linked with the abilities that they actually fulfill, the roles that they have to fulfill within their certain occupation, we always have been demanding them to disclose such private information. We think that in the politician's case, this is much more the case. Then the government team may ask us why we ask more from these politicians. Why do the basic human rights is not a basic right for these individuals? We do that because of one main reason. We think that making a law itself is a very important thing. It can actually change life. It decides your morality. For example, if the law says that we gays are able to marry, we think that it's actually influencing the clear impacts of our life, deciding our morality, whether to support gays or not. We think such can also limit our actions. For example, although my moral standards may actually agree with abortion, agree with euthanasia, agree with uses of contraception, or agree with uses of drugs, if the law and if the politicians make a certain law that limits my rights and limits my choice, we think this itself is a significant impact that imposing on individuals' lives. That's why we always expect more from the politicians, because these politicians are the only person who can influence my choice and influence my lives. That's what we do. We demand them more sense of morality and even more stricter law for example, when we imply a certain laws. But before that, yes.
How is it specifically relevant then that what I do at home? Where is the line that are you going to draw on privacy, or is everything okay that the media can report?
Because what you do at home is actually what they may actually do at the politician regional, and also not only about that, what they do at home can be a significant factor for us to be relieved on my choice and us to be trusting a certain politicians. Also, we think that what they do at home is not significantly different from what they might actually propose as a law or as a future of the society. So the second question is, when does the current media efforts is too bad, or is it okay? They say that these media is actually doing it more than what they have to do, and how they function as politicians is different. Our private lives is different from their actually job's role. But we do not think so. We think that able to separate the ideas that they can actually able to separate their private lives and jobs is too idealistic for us to believe. But more than that, we think that it has to be decided by the citizens who actually have to choose someone that change their future. We think that that's the reason why we actually let them to disclose criminal records and tax frauds when he or she was not even the records before they were actually politicians. Why do we do that? Because we think that they should not make any mistake, because one mistake can be detrimental for the society's future. And we provide such kind of stricter standards to politicians because their position are too unique. But why should we know about their lives? Because first of all, we think the ability is actually related, because we do not know what legislation or how they will act in the future, and such different character in private life can actually influence their choice. And that's why, for the sake of check and balance, these citizens should know what kind of person he or she is. But second reason is more important. We think that secondly, normally when citizens go to in an election, when citizens make a choice to pick what candidates they want to entrust them a position to lead the country. Now, we think that more than a policy is actually taking into a significant factor in their choice. They actually choose not based on the policy in itself, but actually choose based on what kind of visions that politicians may have. What kind of visions that what kind of country that our country will look like, how our country will look like, based on what kind of visions or what kind of person that politician is. That's why we need to know what kind of person he or she is. For example, we cannot actually know everything from statistics. Let's say, for example, a politician is actually upholding women's rights or feminism ideas, but if he has like numerous scandals with numerous amount of girls, or actually if he has his private life seem to be significantly proving that he's not actually his morality is actually against the feminism value, of course we need to know who that person is to actually fully entrust them to oppose certain policies related to feminist ideas. And also secondly, if the individual is actually pursuing for the goal to reduce the gap between rich and poor, but that individual is wearing extreme luxuriance outside the street when he walks on the street, we think that itself is also the clear things that citizens can see and decide whom to trust and whom to not trust. We think that such vision is very important for citizens' decision-making process, because at the end of the day, those politicians are becoming the leader of that individuals and who's impacting these individuals' lives. That's why we strongly oppose to these motions that private lives should also be revealed for us to make a proper choice and for the countries to be very legitimate. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, what did the previous speaker tell us? He said that it's important for us to know the type of person that you are. And in order to know the type of person that you are, we need to know everything that you are doing, right? Because everything that you're doing could affect your job, because your job depends on the type of person that you are. We think this is incredibly broad, and we disagree. We think that's the direction that has gone in the wrong path. People are choosing politicians based on the subjective criteria of the type of person that you are. I want to choose the person who looks good, who sends positive values, who is cultured, who sends this subjective message, which then politicians exploit, which then the media sells. So you end up trying to pick these kind of vague role models. And while we admit that people can choose for whatever reason, and there is an element of subjectivity, we think this goes overboard. We think the value needs to be on the person's track record. You should look at that person's resume, not, as the previous speaker said, look at the clothes that he wears on the streets in order to understand his policies on poverty, because that is more easily massaged and that leads to the wrong message. We are very concerned about where the line will be drawn, because we don't think the opposition team drew any line. And if anything, they justify any sort of intervention into a politician's life. And we think that is incredibly dangerous, right? Because it removes the whatever notion of privacy which we think my previous speaker developed is a fundamental right. But we think it's also very dangerous because when there are no lines, then there is no natural check and balance, because that's what the people expect now. You expect this 100% invasion into an individual's life. You want to know what he wears, what he eats, where he sleeps, what he watches on TV, what he said to his wife, what he took to his daughter's school. So how can there be a check and balance when that will be what people will expect them to do? In response, the last thing we will say is that it's completely unnecessary, because some of the things that he talked about, he said it's okay when it affects their jobs, when you want to know your criminal records and your tax records. And we think, yes, exactly. Well, these things are open information, right? But it's not all the time. If my job has nothing to do with something which puts me in the position of harming other people, then you don't have a right to know my criminal information. In the US presidential elections, they don't release their health records unless they want to release the health records. It isn't a fundamental requirement, right? So we think the way people can know subjective things is true. The interviews is true. The debates that these politicians have and should be about evaluating their track records. That's how we pick good politicians, not popular politicians. And we think that's the problem with our political system. Yes, sir.
If citizens should decide their politicians based on their public life, in the eyes of politicians, then why do you ask them to disclose their criminal record and tax record when they, before become a politician?
Because those things have a direct and actual correlation to their job. If I am what is published in terms of your criminality is a public record that everyone should have, because they want to know whether you have broken the law. When I break the law, I commit a crime against society, and society has a right to know of people who committed that crime against me. Knowing my track record, my taxes or my assets is because I am entrusted with huge amounts of money, and that is a direct way to check whether I am corrupt or not corrupt. But what clothes I wear on the street has absolutely no relationship with my job, and we think that's something that we should completely ignore. In fact, that's something that we should discourage, right? So I'm going to defend and extend the idea that my previous speaker spoke about. My previous speaker spoke about how he has no correlation with the person's job as a candidate, and how this empowers tabloid journalism and why it is a fundamental right. I'm going to argue how it harms politics specifically, and also then justifies a greater abuse of privacy and specifically harming certain minority groups. So how does it specifically harm politics? I've spoken about generally how it encourages a more negative type of politics. It encourages gossip. It encourages rumors. It doesn't encourage an evaluation of legislation or policy. If you want to know, like the Prime Minister said, the person's position on feminist rights, then look at how that person has voted on legislation related to feminism, which is public information, because that's how I need to know whether my candidates have supported my position or not my position. I don't need to know what that person said to his girlfriend when he was 19 years old, because we don't think that's relevant. The harm, we think, is that this will discourage some people from joining politics and attract only a certain type of politician. It attracts politicians who want to be celebrities, who are able to manipulate and to use the media. Politicians, for example, Colin Powell, who was the Secretary of Defense of the United States of America, purposely refused to run for presidency because he did not want to be in this type of limelight. He didn't want to put his family through this. And we think this discourages people who focus on their job and encourages people who love celebrity, who love popularity, right? We think further, it justifies a greater abuse of privacy at any level. When you cannot draw a line and you say that when people want to know, when it's important, when it may be useful for any kind of decision that I have, then what stops people tracking all your conversations? But what stops companies from collecting information from you as you use the internet? What stops other people from observing you putting CCTV in the street? Because maybe something could go wrong. We think this is a death of privacy as a value in society, and something that we as society need to stand up. Finally, we think this is especially harmful for minorities, for people who have different opinions, right? So the Prime Minister said, if you're homosexual, that's important. We think it's not important, because even if I'm homosexual, that doesn't mean I'm going to automatically campaign for pro-homosexuality. Because if that's the case, then we would never have pro-women legislation or pro-abortion legislation, because they're mostly men in the legislature, right? So we think we need to make a distinction between that individual and going after individuals, but rather focus on the things and the work that they do. And if that, we think, is not only the fairer value in society, but as I've showed you through my speech and through my excellent first speaker speech, it leads to far more benefits, and the status quo is far more harmful. For all those reasons, we proudly defend privacy.
Do we think that team government consent that if private life can influence the ability of their job, and then we can deprive the right of the privacy, right? So this debate is not about politicians as a privacy or not. This debate has to be judged based on the fact that whether private life of the politicians will influence their ability of the jobs, right? But I think government has a very tricky and difficult line of logic. He said some deprive of the privacy is okay, but some deprive of privacy is not okay. He said some things, but he never drew the clear line. What things is good things and what things is bad things. I agree with that. We cannot draw the 100% what is the clear line, what we need and what we don't need. That is why people and citizens should draw the line rather than the media, rather than the law, rather than the team government. With that, I have one argument. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why politicians should have a chance to defend themselves if certain people talk about their private life. If media cannot openly discuss about their private life, all the rumors is going to be influenced decision of the citizens. And before moving on to my first argument, I'm going to engage some of the point made by the Logan. We think that LO did a pretty much good job to show that how private life of the politicians and their job ability, right? We think that if we did not choose the politicians based on the promise of the politicians, right? We choose the politicians based on the visions they have. If I choose the certain peoples, and then I can expect what kind of countries we can make. That is why we think that they have to see the all informations about the politicians. If I said in the public, I like the women's movement, but I have 20 different girlfriends and I beat my wife in my house, we think that there's a clear differences between their public life and private life. The only argument made by Logan was people can differentiate public life and private life, but I don't think that is true. Because we cannot judge these people's public life, and we cannot judge the politicians based on their ability. Yes.
So someone who is not gay cannot support gay marriage?
No, that's not true. That is why people should decide, right? If I'm not a gay and my private life and my activity and my behavior support the gay right movement, and because people is not stupid, that is why he think that this guy can make the right gay right movement, right? But if I only talked about gay right movement, but in my private life, I talk bad things about the gay, I am the member of the gay haters movement, then clearly people can see these people is lying in the public life. That is why people don't want to share the vision of the countries and these politicians. That is why we must let people know the private life of the politicians, because it makes their life the better, right? They talked about checks and balances can be happen, but I don't think that is true. Elo said that many people do not know the process of legislations, right? People do not know that what kind of legislations politicians made, since many things just quickly made and the passed, right? So even if I talked I am a gay right movement, but actually people cannot see these politicians make the legislation which is related to gay right movement. That is why we must see their private life to share the vision of the countries, right? And Logan make an argument, where is the line? But like I said before, we don't know the line, and you don't know the line too. That is why citizens must draw the line, rather than media and the politicians draw the line. Why? If people don't want to know the private life of politicians, and media create a lot of private life, the media is going to get a lot of low fame, bad fame. That is why media don't have any incentive to do something goes against interest of the citizens, right? If in the current status quo, the citizens want to know about the private life of the politicians, then that one should be disclosed to the people, because people has to decide what kind of politicians they want to have in our society. That is why we like the policy disclose the private life of politicians. Let's move on to my last argument. Why politicians is not going to have the opportunity to counterbalance the rumors which is made by certain blog and certain peoples, right? If we disclose the private life of the politicians is not going to recognize what kind of rumors is going to happen in the status quo, right? Just because we disclose the privacy of the politicians, that doesn't mean there will be a lot of rumors. That doesn't mean there's a lot of doubt, among the citizens. That is why our policy is better than their policy in terms of informed choices, right? If I am the politicians and the media report about my private life, and then I can go to the media and then I defend myself, that is not true. Even if that is true, I'm a new kind of person. That is why you can choose me as a politician. I have the better visions, right? But on the government policy, politicians cannot do those kind of stuff. That is why we think that there will be less informed choice and citizens cannot make proper choice when they choose the politicians. So we strongly oppose this motion.